Okay, I think it's good.
Okay, so I received the invitation and it's working for me. So you have the join webinar and you just click there and it works.
It's private. Come on. What? No, I wanna check out.
So you have this meeting is being live streamed by staying in this meeting, blah, blah, blah.
See, now it is.
Yeah, I believe it's live now.
Okay.
I paused it.
No, you interrupted.
I interrupted it.
See, you put play here.
Yeah. Do we want it live, Asi? Here? Yeah, that would work.
So yeah, it's now live. I see you in YouTube right now. No, it's live.
Do we want it live, Asi? Here? Yeah, that would work.
So yeah, you're now live. I see you in YouTube right now.
Yeah. Okay, so does this work?
Yep.
Oh,
It's live.
when did I know it? It's in the. No, there is the.
Yeah, so yeah. Can you put it in your screen?
Yeah, I didn't introduce myself sometimes.
No.
Doug from the actually.
Oh, nice. There you go.
So Marilu, are you making me host again?
Oh yeah, sorry about that.
Nice.
A ver, participants. Gonzalo. No. Which are you? Which panel? What's your name here?
SDCC. SDCC. Yep.
Do you want to be host or co-host?
A host, I think. So like I can start the. That's it.
Okay, I think you're host now.
And I'll try to see if you are still there. Yeah, it's still live, so that's fine.
It says you're host now.
Yep.
Okay, perfect.
Perfect, thank you. So what we will start 5 minutes before, you think?
You shall set the camera. That camera. Yeah. Maybe a bit closer, no? That's okay. Did you see Anita? Wait, have you seen Anita? Anita is with us.
Hey, Brid.
Hi.
Hi. I wish I were there, Brid. Sorry.
Great to see you.
Yes.
Reassuring to see you, actually.
No, it's great to be here. Have you had a good indication of who may be in the room?
Yeah. Good.
Sorry?
So do we already know how many people are expected?
Well, we have some 100 registered online, and we don't know how many will be here. It's part of the experiment.
Yes.
Oh, Fiona is joining us as well.
Yes. Hi, Fiona.
Hi, teacher.
Hi.
Gonzalo.
Hi, Fiona. How are you?
I'm well, thanks.
Do I have to use my Zoom link to join or not?
No.
No, I just
No.
speak here.
Of course not.
Okay.
So let me see. You that's the camera. So when you speak, you better speak to the camera or to the public.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Okay. Do you make? Yeah, hello.
Yes, I hear you.
So is it working? Danny, it's okay, no?
Good morning, Daniel. How are things in Geneva?
Daniel. You're on mute, Danny.
Realize. Yeah, everything is well. A little bit warm here in Geneva as well.
Okay.
But I check everything is working well.
So you're gonna run the PowerPoint.
Yes, it's here already.
I'll signal to you when to switch.
Mhm.
Oh, that's actually a bit of a problem.
What?
Okay, I'll keep.
What is the problem?
No. I'll have to tell you in my hand and then to go to the next.
See, yes, of course.
Okay. Because there's a group of slides which just go quickly in order, the semicircles, the circles, the overlapping diagrams. But I'll send you.
No. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, for joining. We are still waiting for Ambassador Akram and Ambassador Pedroso. Gonzalo, I don't know if you heard any news about them. Thank you very much, all participants to the webinar for your participation. We are starting the webinar now. I would like to remind you that this webinar is going to be live streamed in YouTube in the account of ESCR-Net, as well as recorded. Again, thank you very much for your participation. And please, I would like to give the floor to Breathe, our moderator for the day of today, so that we can start now the seminar. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I think it's my task to welcome all of you. My name is Fiona Dove. I'm the Executive Director of the Transnational Institute. On behalf of our co-hosts, so that's TNI and the South Centre, as well as our co-sponsors, Corporate Accountability and the International Network for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, ESCR-Net, I'd like to welcome you to this public discussion. It's being held in hybrid form, so we have a number of people joining online, as well as physically in New York. In light of the forthcoming Summit of the Future to be convened by the United Nations Secretary General in September 2024, next year, we thought it important to highlight the intensifying efforts to legitimate a direct role for transnational corporations in global governance. The Trojan horse for this legitimation is the concept of multi-stakeholderism, whereby corporations, states, and civil society are all considered equivalent stakeholders in matters of global public policy. Besides the obvious matter of conflicts of interest on the part of corporations, whose main commitment is to making as much profit as possible for shareholders, many of these corporations, who are also mainly based in the global north, have accumulated wealth and power that often exceeds that of many UN member states, never mind organized associations of working people or civil society groups working for the public interest. The battle against corporate capture of states and public policy is older than I am, and it requires constant vigilance to ensure that democratic fundamentals are respected, that states have the sovereignty to govern in the best interests of their populations, and that the public interest really can be served. There is no doubt that a beleaguered, underfinanced, and often marginalized United Nations needs a reboot to deal with the litany of crises facing the world, with the new global pandemics, the threat of nuclear war, or the multiplicity of climate change consequences the world has to face. Any reboot requires enhancing the capacity of the United Nations as the most representative global institution we have to tackle these challenges. The upcoming Summit of the Future is an opportunity to do so, but this will not come through affording corporations further power to shape our world and how we cope with the huge social and environmental challenges that we face. Indeed, one might say that these corporations are in many ways part of why we have these challenges in the first place. We need to ensure that their license to operate is conditional on them working within the bounds of what is the public interest, and that this be defined by elected political representatives in consultation with civil society constituencies. We cannot allow the foxes to determine what is in the best interest of the hens. Multi-stakeholderism is a dangerous concept to apply at the level of global governance. It blurs public and private interests. It ignores the balances of power that determine policy outcomes, and it obfuscates decision-making and accountability processes. Global governance comes down to power and influence. Our task is to ensure that those to be empowered and have more influence are states of the majority world, in meaningful consultation with representatives of the most vulnerable social constituencies and those dedicated to working for the public interest, not to further grow the power and influence of those whose sole purpose is the extraction of profit by whatever means we allow. Today, we're going to hear a presentation from Dr. Harris Glekman, and that will be followed by a panel of esteemed discussants, and then we will open to the floor. So if I could quickly introduce Dr. Glekman. He's been tracking the multi-stakeholderist trend at global governance level for more than a decade now. His presentation is based on a report that he was commissioned to write by the South Center, and which is about to be published. Dr. Glekman was formerly the head of the New York office of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD. He also worked for the UN Center on Transnational Corporations back in the day. And he's currently a senior fellow at the Center for Governance and Sustainability at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He's a board member of the Foundation for Global Governance and Sustainability, otherwise known as FOGS. He's the director of Benchmark Environmental Consulting, and he's an associate of the Transnational Institute. We have 4 esteemed panelists to lead us in the discussion on the issues that Harris will raise. These are Ambassador Akram Munir, Pakistan's permanent representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Pedro Luis Pedroso, Cuba's permanent representative to the United Nations, Professor Carlos Correa, the executive director of the South Center, and Dr. Anita Gurumurthy, who's the executive director of IT for Change. We're really pleased they could all make it, and thank you in advance for playing this role. I will now hand the floor over to Harris Glekman for his presentation. Thank you.
And the role of developing countries. We're looking forward very much to quite an exchange and dialogue on this. And especially we do hope to maybe towards the end of our conversation, actually to see what are the possibilities that will come after the ministerial that's scheduled now for September 23. This, we expect, will be kicking off a very important process, and we hope we can discuss and explore, especially with our government representatives, how we in civil society can work together with your objectives for the outcomes of the Summit of the Future. So I hand over now to Martin, and you will introduce Harris, no?
Well, actually, Fiona did very well, so I'm not going to repeat what she already said. Welcome to everybody. I'm Martin Drago from Friends of the Earth International, and I give you the mic to Harris. We have 15, 20 minutes maximum. We will show this sign for the time is approaching to end.
Thank you very much for being here today. A special thank you to the Transnational Institute and the South Center for inviting me to develop this paper to share with you. The question in the air in the moment is, what kind of global governance will be the next phase? One candidate that's being proposed is to formalize multi-stakeholderism adjacent to or under the umbrella of multilateralism, which some are calling UN 2.0. Based on this, I'd like to share some of my research and that of TNI and South Center on the challenges that multi-stakeholderism presents to multilateralism, why TNC involvement in global governance is problematic at best, and that multi-stakeholderism is not an appropriate part of the next phase of global governance. Next slide. Global governance can be understood as a combination of a narrative, a set of institutions, and political power. And my introduction to the paper, which has come out and available online and in physical copy, has 5 parts. A presentation about what's the difference between multilateralism and multi-stakeholderism. Looking at one of the narratives presented by the proponents of multi-stakeholderism to show why that narrative doesn't work. Picking up in the paper, identifying 6 challenges that multi-stakeholderism presents to multilateralism. Some steps that governments can take at the multilateral level to constrain the further development of multi-stakeholderism. And maybe a way to kick off some of the discussion about a vision that's different than the one being currently discussed for UN 2.0. Next slide, please. The narrative at the moment has some roots in the work of the World Economic Forum, when they commissioned a multi-year study of what should be the component of governance to go with their multi-stakeholder management strategy. One of the key lines, in fact, one of the first lines, says they want to redefine the international system as constituting a wider, multifaceted system of global cooperation in which intergovernmental legal frameworks and institutions are embedded as a core, but not the sole and sometimes not the most crucial component. This narrative has been picked up by the Secretary General's report on our common agenda. Next, please. Where he invited governments to convene a high-level multi-stakeholder summit for the future to advance ideas of governance and arrangements in the area of international concern and potentially others where the governance arrangements are nascent or requiring updating. The important part of both of these quotations is that the tough new issues, the ones which are not currently on the international agenda, can be taken away from the intergovernmental process. And those which are currently recognized as gaps may not be filled by the multilateral system, but by another arrangement of multi-stakeholderism. In the report, the memorandum of understanding between the Office of the Secretary General and the World Economic Forum is included as an annex. And also the report identifies 6 other calls for multi-stakeholder activities under the umbrella of the preparations for the summit for the future or outcomes. Next slide, please. What I want to share with you is a quick overview of what's the difference between multi-stakeholder governance and multilateral governance and multi-stakeholder governance. First is an obvious one, that in multilateralism, the decision makers are all governments. In multi-stakeholderism, there are some governments, some transnational corporations, some civil societies, some scholars, and some others. The narrative base for their actions in multilateralism is the Charter, And in multi-stakeholderism, I'm suggesting it's the report, the Global Redesign Initiative. Multilateralism prides itself on a democratic principle: one country, one vote. There is no such democratic principle in multi-stakeholderism. In practice, of course, in the multilateral arena, there's a disproportionate power by some governments. Under multi-stakeholderism, there's a disproportionate power by transnational corporations and some governments. The UN has a rule book to protect the rights of smaller countries and to make sure that the procedural rights for all are protected. In multi-stakeholderism, there is no common set of rule books for how decisions are made within the group. Governments can use binding instruments, treaties, conventions, and voluntary initiatives. Multi-stakeholder initiatives are voluntary only. Those who wish to follow, follow, and those who don't wish to follow are unconnected to the outcome of that process. Public disclosure, important for global trust. In multilateralism, there are reports of actions, and there's reports about the finances. In the case of multi-stakeholder groups, there are not regular reports about even the actions taken, and virtually no reports about sources of money, who receives money for, or transfers of money between participants. Legitimacy for multilateralism is national sovereignty. We'll return to that later. In multi-stakeholderism, it's based on economic power and what I'm called sharing the legitimacy of the other participants. Multilateralism, the track record for actually funding the development is really not very good. But under multi-stakeholder, it's worse. And last, as a comparative piece, is the ability to regulate. Governments can regulate, as I observed, by conventions. Corporations have the ability to regulate indirectly states through the investor dispute panels. So that gives you a sense of what we mean when we say multilateralism is quite different from multi-stakeholderism and brings with it a number of serious limitations in the credibility of global governments. One of the narratives that's advanced is that TNCs and multi-stakeholder groups can help deliver the SDGs. And it's a major position that is frequently heard. We need to get the corporations involved, otherwise we will not meet the SDGs. I want to suggest to you via a series of Venn diagrams that this is a very limited and not a very constructive, viable narrative. We have a set of global needs, global public goods, whether it comes food or health, and a range of things which have been articulated by developing countries, by peoples. And at the same time, there is the private sector, global public markets, globalization. The question is, what's the nature of the relationship of these two? One possibility is that there's 100% convergence. And I think that you'll agree with me that this is clearly not the case. For no other reason, we wouldn't need to have an intergovernmental process if the globalization market met all the global needs. Possible that there's a 50-50 overlap. And I'm going to suggest to you in the same version that clearly this is not the case. So let's look at an overlap of, for conversation purposes, a 5% overlap between the requirements of global public goods and the operations of the globalization market and transnationals and multi-stakeholder groups. There are some implications of even the 5%. Two quick observations. that means that 95% of global needs and goods are unmet by globalization. It also means that 95% of the corporations and the functions of the international market, which cause some of the problems that the SDGs are in place to solve, or ones which there are benefits to those firms and the globalization for their not being solved, or that they're taking actions which are unconnected. The 95% are not attended to and may be part of the cause of the problems for which we need to address. There's also a more challenging observation. That 5% of the TNCs could contribute to meeting these global needs, but they have no way to restrain the 95% of TNCs in the global market on those same matters. I'm suggesting this narrative that's been produced to say why we need multi-stakeholders and corporations in the governance is mistaken. But it is frequently repeated, and I think it's helpful to use these Venn diagrams to show you not only the limitations, but the implied consequences of that statement. The paper goes at some detailed length and looking at 5 specific areas of challenges that multi-stakeholderism presents to developing countries and to multilateral institutions. First, there's an erosion of sovereignty. One clear example I've already hinted at is issues which could be on the intergovernmental agenda are taken off that space. And so the ability of developing countries in the multilateral system to address those crises is reduced. There are other descriptions of the way each of these 6 crises affect developing countries and multilateralism in the paper. The second one is outsourcing of governance. Again, if it's an issue that should be attended to by governments, some are saying, and the Secretary General has been recommending 6 topics that should start out outside of the multilateral system. And we have other examples of internet governance where the governance of this high technology is fundamentally outside of the multilateral system. There's a decline in accountability in trust. Multi-stakeholder groups themselves, the individual participants, unlike states, do not have international law on responsibilities, obligations, and liabilities. And so if something doesn't work, they're able to walk away from the table and the participation, and the pressure comes, the public pressure remains on those who remain. The UN is part of that system. The UN is seen as part of the failure, undermining trust in the multilateral system. Fourth way is a shift in the way in which the OECD governments, who are for the last 20 years or more underfunding major commitments that they have made, who now turn in the public eye and say, well, look, we might have millions, perhaps we might have billions, but look, there are trillions involved in the private sector. And why don't we see if we can shift our public responsibilities in some fashion to the private sector and their trillions. And so the countries are less feeling the obligation to meet their commitments. A fifth area in which there is a tension created by multi-stakeholderism is that the kind of policy programs and actions that are going to evolve are ones which need to be not incompatible with the practices of globalization or the short-term or medium-term concerns of individual firms who are part of that. And the sixth is a corruption of diplomatic language where all people around the table are now called stakeholders, masking the legitimate differences between all the different parties in international affairs. These are elaborated further in the full text of the report. Because what I really want to share with you is that there are directions for governments to constrain this development. For the next slide. For example, to defend against a further erosion of sovereignty at the broader political level, governments can develop an alternate vision for what the UN 2.0 or UN 3.0 might look like. At the procedural level, they could say to the heads of the secretariats that they should submit future memorandums of understanding with multi-stakeholder groups for review of the intergovernmental process. In each area, another one being limiting or outsourcing, the intergovernmental process could say what are the issues that we ought to be dealing with, and the big one might be is to redefine in law the questions of legitimacy, responsibility, and obligation, particularly for those who are claiming to be global governors. And again, in this area and others, there are procedural routes followed. I will leave the other examples for those of you to look at in the paper, but there are plenty of separate options designed to create a menu for what governments could do in the multilateral arena with this to constrain multi-stakeholders expansion. My last one to share of those option issues is to cleanse to recover the diplomatic language and talk about constituencies, citizens, communities, peoples, languages that we have used for many decades instead of stakeholders in partnership. And so it's a challenge to reflect how much it has become part of the common narrative. I hope that conversations today won't mention the S word. One of the bigger responses is to start thinking about what could be a vision, an alternate vision for the governance of the community involving the centrality of the states. And I think it's a tough one because we're facing a constant push toward multi-stakeholderism, and a counter is to think about a vision that is quite different. I'd like to help start that conversation by putting one idea on the table. At the moment, if you want a quick schematic, this is what the multilateral system looks like. Intergovernmental bodies, supported by secretariats, and engaging with the financing and trade bodies. But a possible other way is to have the intergovernmental body orchestrating a much wider role for the multiple constituency bodies in the world in order to take advantage of their knowledge and their political wisdom, and to be the orchestrator of a broader public engagement. Indicative, and these ideas, to be honest with you, have come in part from the work of Morris Strong in building the major group around the Rio conference, and further development through the Foundation for Global Governance and Sustainability in Brussels. So instead of now just being major groups, we can change them to constituency assemblies, where each of these groups could provide their expertise, their political views, which are quite different within each of the different constituencies, to the governments. And now we would collect those views and strengthen the orchestrating capacity of the intergovernmental system. But another step would be that annually, the intergovernmental process says to these constituency assemblies, we've got some policy questions. We'd like to hear from parliamentarians, from scientists, from feminists, what they think of these policy questions to help the intergovernmental process be a stronger manager of the global world. So these are parts of the paper that is now being launched today by the South Center and the Transnational Institute. And we hope that we can continue to share this and discuss this with developing country governments and all governments and civil society. And I want to thank again the South Center and the Institute for Transnational Institute for inviting me to put together this research and sharing it with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. So with the permission of Ambassador Munir, we would like to switch the order of the ambassador's speeches because Ambassador Pedroso has a last minute appointment and he asked to intervene before. Is that okay? So thank you. Now we're gonna give the floor to Ambassador Pedro Luis Pedroso, which is the United Nations Permanent Representative of Cuba in New York. So Ambassador Pedroso, you have the floor.
Good morning to everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this very timely presentation about multistakeholderism and participation of civil society in the work of the UN. Can you hear to me properly?
Yes.
Yes, but we cannot see you, so yeah, that's better. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
To us, to Cuba, the participation of different stakeholders in the work of the United Nations has been widely recognized and is very important one. The preamble of the 2030 Agenda highlights a spirit of strengthened global solidarity, focusing in particular on the needs of the poorest and most vulnerable, and with the participation of all countries, all stakeholders, and all people. The 2030 Agenda recalls how the Sustainable Development Goals are the result of over 2 years of intensive public consultation and engagement with civil society and other stakeholders around the world, which pay particular attention to the voices of the poorest and most vulnerable. We have to remind as well, talking about multi-stakeholderism and participation of civil society in the work of the UN, the very important background that said the first United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in Rio in 1992, and its main outcome known as Agenda 21, which was the first UN platform that opened the way for the participation of major groups in the work of the United Nations. We have to remind how Agenda 21 set a very important basis for the participation of groups like women groups, the youth, the entrepreneurship sector, and so on. So it was a very wide agenda for opening the doors of the UN and the multilateral setting to the participation of civil society and other stakeholders. I think this is a very important background that we have to remind ourselves when talking about this issue. Having said that, I think we have to recognize, at least in our own view, that the proposals we are seeing in the UN 2.0 project go beyond, much more beyond that. And that is an important feature of those proposals on the UN 2.0. I want to say also at the outset that there should not be misleading interpretations of the concerns, particularly those by developing countries, in regard to multi-stakeholderism, which is something totally different. The misinterpretation might have the deliberate intention to confuse people with the idea that the ones who express concern on this notion are totally opposed to the participation of other stakeholders in the work of the United Nations. As I already said, proposals on the UN 2.0 project aims to reform the global governance system by involving more actors, sector and voices, other than member states, in decision-making processes. This notion goes beyond the system of international relations as we all know it nowadays. While it may seem appealing as a way to promote inclusiveness and diversity, multi-stakeholderism can also pose serious challenges and risks for member states, in particular for developing countries. It could lead to potential, or it has the potential, to undermine the sovereignty and legitimacy of states, especially the smallest and most vulnerable actors, by allowing non-state actors to influence or interfere in their domestic affairs by imposing on promoting a standard that has nothing to do with the political construct of these countries. Some of the main difficulties that we find and challenges and risks for developing countries are the following. The proposals on the UN 2.0 project might undermine the intergovernmental character of the organization and trespassing the principle of sovereign equality of all member states established by the UN Charter. Multi-stakeholderism and UN 2.0 may undermine also the sovereignty and autonomy of developing countries, as they may have to accept or comply with norms, standards, or policies that are not in their best interest or that do not reflect their values or preferences. They may not either have the same resources, capacities, and abilities as the more powerful and influential stakeholders. The kind of new participation in the system, including in decision-making processes, means that member states, transnational corporations, organizations of all kind and level of representation, and other actors could be participating at the same level across the UN system. No doubt that this would change dramatically the nature of the organization and the way in which decision-making is done at international level. How to define the level of representation, how it would work for votes, membership to the UN, membership to the different organs and bodies, for example. Multi-stakeholderism and UN 2.0 may create new inequalities and imbalances of power among different stakeholders, as some may have more access, influence, or legitimacy than others. This may result in further marginalization or exclusion of developing countries' perspectives, especially those of the most vulnerable or disadvantaged groups and countries. To put it blunt, it would imply deepening the current imbalances in the international decision-making system. That is something that developing countries, and particularly the G77 and China, has put at the front of its agenda, especially when discussing the 2030 agenda and the fulfillment of the SDG along the line with the reform of the international financial architecture. Multistakeholderism and UN 2.0 may increase the complexity and uncertainty of the global governance system, as they may introduce more actors, interests, and conflicts of interest into the already crowded and contested arena, as different stakeholders may have divergent or incompatible goals, values, or agenda. And this without cost for those major stakeholders. Member states will continue financing the UN budget, the salary of the UN Secretariat, while at the same time opening the door for further engagement by these actors who will not be paying any cost. We can just take a look at the complex scenario we face today, at a moment in which there is only formal participation of member states and groups of member states in the process of decision-making at the UN. We can take the case, for example, of the high-level processes developing this year, the SDG Summit, the 3 health-related processes, and the preparations for the Summit of the Future. Developing countries have suffered so much in the negotiations, having to face the reluctance of developed countries to accept even language and consensus existing from many years ago. Some of them going back to the Rio conference that I already mentioned in 1992. Then one can imagine how backsliding and regressive could be with the participation of other powerful actors working in the same line, or even a stronger one, than developed countries. Multistakeholderism and UN 2.0 may require more resources, capacities, and skills from developing countries, as they may have to engage more actively and issues. Developing countries may lack the necessary financial, human, or technical resources, or the institutional or organizational capabilities to participate fully and meaningfully in multi-stakeholder processes or initiatives. Multi-stakeholderism can lack transparency, accountability, and democratic oversight, as the processes and outcomes of multi-stakeholder initiative might not be subject to public scrutiny or legal standards. This can create opportunities for corruption, manipulation, or capture by vested interests. In conclusion, multi-stakeholderism is not a panacea for governance challenges, particularly those that were confronted today, as some could claim, but rather a potential threat for developing countries and for the multilateral system as a whole. Developing countries should be cautious and critical of multi-stakeholder initiatives and ensure that they protect their national interests and priorities, as well as the rights and needs of their people. All of this is not to say that we don't give importance and priority to legitimate participation of major groups and civil society organizations, as we know today, following very well practices and standards set in the UN. And we have very wide participation of major groups in different UN major international conferences. We have a system by which we have the widest participation from all of the region, but this is not the case again for the new platforms that we see entrenched in the UN processes. There is, by the other side, a great difference between the participation of multi-stakeholders and civil society organizations from developed countries and from developing countries, which lack in this last case, in most of the cases, from resources, both financial and human, to follow and attend properly most of the UN processes. So what we can see today is particularly or basically a bunch of civil society or multi-stakeholder organizations from developed countries practically replicating the agenda of our developed country partners in multilateral processes. So this is an eye-opener, an issue that we should follow closely and with caution. And as I said, it's not a blank check for widening or painting a more participatory and inclusive UN or multilateral system. So these are the basic ideas that I wanted to convey this morning to you. And I would be ready if there is any question. So thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for the opportunity and thank you for the attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We really appreciate that you've been able to join us this morning, and we look forward very much actually to continuing in this process of exchange and collaboration. Thank you. It's now a great pleasure to turn to Ambassador Munir and to invite his perspectives on our agenda today. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you very much for inviting me. And let me start by expressing my deep appreciation to Harris. I think we've been talking about this for some time now, with regard to the whole issue of multi-stakeholder, multilateral, and such. But let me recall that in the 1970s, our effort at that time, truth is, but the effort at that time was to see how the international community, the United Nations, could better regulate multinational corporations. And we had a whole department within the United Nations Secretariat which dealt with multinational corporations as such, and suddenly it disappeared as such, and that was quite interesting that it disappeared. But now what is happening is there is a reverse effort by those same multinational corporations that we were trying to control through the UN to come back and control the UN as such. So this is a counter, as they say, the empire effect. It's, you know, it's obvious if you see what is the impacts of multi-stakeholderism in the real world as such. You look at the investor dispute settlement business, where a country, a corporation investing $300 million ends up with an award of $10 billion from the country concerned. Let's make it worse. There is something wrong, obviously, in that. The imbalance in power between states, or at least developing countries, and multinational corporations. You look at how standards develop in a private body such as the FATF, financial transactions, are then imposed on states and which are put on blacklists and gray lists and white lists, so that their financial transactions in the market are affected by unilateral positions taken by governmental and individuals and different unknown people. You see how soft law developed by such bodies as the FATF and other private bodies and standards and so forth are brought in and become hard law through the adoption of Chapter 7 resolutions in the Security Council. You see in the whole issue of IT regulation that the ownership of both the hardware and the software, 70% with the private sector. And obviously they're not going to give up that control. And the discussions we're having on the digital compact so far have not even touched on this issue of the imbalance in power in these negotiations between the private sector and governments, like these governments of developing countries. You look at COVAX and what happened to us through COVAX, which is supposed to be the facilitator in mobilizing money, etc., etc. But whose end result was that those companies were able to produce, but produce for profit and produce only for those who could pay them. So that vaccine availability in the developing countries was grossly unequal and remains so to this day, as far as I know. These are just some of the impacts of this so-called multi-stakeholders who we are called upon to treat as equals in the United Nations. And this is something that we have to resist. And as soon as the OCA report came out, we looked at the report. And it was my delegation which stood up in the General Assembly on behalf of a group of like-minded countries to speak out against the concept of multi-stakeholderism in the OCA report. And that report, multi-stakeholderism to govern outer space, the digital compact, reform, put the trusteeship council as a multi-stakeholder organization, move the agenda for women away from intergovernmental to multi-stakeholder body. The whole summit of the future to be negotiated on a multi-stakeholder basis. The whole high-level advisory board appointed without intergovernmental decisions and advocating multi-stakeholder structures. So it all seems as if the concept, the summit of the future of the UN 2.0 that is talked about, that the whole concept, the whole purpose is to transform the United Nations from member state organization and hand it over to civil society, etc. The question now is not so much the analysis, and I think Harris has done a wonderful job analyzing the whole situation. The question now is, what is the political action that developing countries ought to take in order to respond to the situation? And I think one of the first things we need to do is, instead of talking amongst ourselves, first of all, we ought to sit and formulate a whole set of principles, adopt them by Group 77, as to what is our position on this issue of multistakeholderism, and specifically in response to the Summit of the Future negotiations. Secondly, we have to resist when the President of the Assembly convenes of these consultations in a format, one session with member states, one session with multi-stakeholders. Why? Is that a sort of manifestation of trying to be equitable to people who do not have any stake in this organization? How much do the multinational corporations pay to the United Nations budget? Why ought they to be put on the same pedestal as member states? And I think the structure of participation by outside civil society, private sector, that has to be done on a case-by-case basis. It cannot be just that we apply a flat rule that they will participate on a 50-50 basis member state. It has to be different. Each sector is different, and their participation must be different, and their participation must be geared towards producing the most equitable and positive results for the people of developing countries, for the people of all countries. That should be the objective of their participation, and it has to be custom built in each area as such. And we have to see where this is hurting us. And I mentioned a few examples. I don't think we should ever let something like COVAX happen in the WTO and in the WHO. WHO has to have the control. And member states have to have control rather than the kind of experience that we go through. And it's only because we have succumbed to the fact that you can only get money if you create this multi-hybrid organization. But the question is, if somebody really wants to help in a pandemic, why wouldn't he give the same money to an intergovernmental organization? Why do we have to have a private organization to get the money? As such, we don't trust member states and they trust the private organizations. I think there's some disconnect in the logic which has led us into all this, the USAID aid funding, the COVAX funding. There's some gap in appreciation that has allowed us to accept this kind of structures as such. And I think lastly, I'd like to say, we have to guard against infiltration of so-called multi-stakeholder thinking into the security and disarmament debate, because that could be dangerous. Because we know how arms races are fueled and where the motivations are made. And we do not want our arms control institutions to be infiltrated. And I suspect I see glimmers of that already. And I think that is something that we have to guard against in the future. I'll stop here. There's much more to be said, but I'll stop here. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
That was a very good opener or something.
So thank you very much, Ambassador. We are now moving to give the floor to Professor Carlos Correa. He's the Executive Director of the South Center. And Carlos will give you the floor.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Is it okay?
Clear.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And let me welcome our participants and in particular our speakers, Ambassador Munir, Pedroso, Anita, to this meeting. We are very, very, very thankful for the possibility of organizing this with the Transnational Institute. And so this is this very important issue for the future of global governance and the participation of developing countries. Let me also thank Professor Harris Gleckman for his excellent report on the subject that is being published maybe tomorrow. By the way, Professor Gleckman has worked on this issue for many years. He has made extremely useful contribution. He has alerted us before this report, for sure, about the risks of this approach of this multi-stakeholder approach for global governance and developing countries. He described the problem properly. He has described the characteristics of this problem. He has highlighted the risks that developing countries face. And he has made, and this is very important, some recommendations how to do that. And also appreciate very much the action plan that Ambassador Munir has just presented us. We fully agree that these actions need to be taken. Certainly, we attach a lot of importance to the preparations for the summit for the future. And as it was already mentioned, there is a strong push for this multi-stakeholder approach in the context of this summit, as well as Ambassador Munir has also mentioned, for instance, in the context of the Global Digital Compact, in which it's very clear that the approach of the Secretary General is to go for a multi-stakeholder approach and with all the risks that this presents for our countries, developing countries. As you know, the South Center is an intergovernmental organization of developing countries established by developing countries, and we work for developing countries, and certainly is a major matter of concern for us, this trend towards a multi-stakeholder approach. As Ambassador Munir has said very clearly in the past, the approach was to control transnational corporations, and now it seems that the approach is to give them the lead in international relations. And of course, this is not admissible in the context of the UN and completely contrary to the principles of the UN Charter. And certainly this new report by Professor Gleckman is very timely and very comprehensive. It does include analysis and also very specific recommendations how to address this problem. But let me focus now on one of the main actors, one of the main stakeholders in this proposed scheme, and these clearly are the transnational corporations. Let me present some indicators about the power of these corporations. In the first place, if we look, for instance, at some OECD reports, transnational corporations account for about 30% of the global GDP. Just for comparison, the United States account for 25%. Of course, many of the companies are located in the United States, but 30% of GDP is really a major figure. They are responsible for more than half of world exports. Just to give you an example, in the case of France, 80% of exports are done by transnational corporations. And although some multinational corporations have been born in particular in BRICS countries, in some developing countries, if you look at the ownership of production by foreign affiliates, more than 90% of this production is controlled by multinationals which are located in OECD countries. And certainly there are some other studies. For instance, UNCTAD has studied in depth the so-called global value chains. And these studies show that in perhaps 80% or more of the cases, these global value chains are dominated by transnational corporations as well. There is also a lot of evidence about tax avoidance by these corporations. In fact, many of them in the digital economy do businesses in our countries, but they do not pay taxes in our countries. As you know, the OECD has developed the so-called two-pillar solution, which in the view of the South Center, we have worked quite a lot on this, does not provide the full solution to this problem of tax avoidance. And certainly, as it was mentioned by Fiona at the very beginning, some of these corporations have revenues that exceed the GDP of many of UN member countries. Let me address another aspect, which is also very important. These companies, because their economic power, as I have just mentioned, also have significant power to lobby their own governments. And therefore, the governments, and as it is well known, are very sensitive to the lobbying the request and the point of view of these companies. For instance, just to give an example, in 2021, in accordance to one report, health companies invested $700 million for lobbying the US federal government. There is another study made in 2020, which indicated that the pharmaceutical industry alone spent $6 billion in the last 20 years in order to lobby governments around the world. Of course, the US government and many governments also in developing countries. And certainly, these governments benefit from the revenues from transnational corporations, and their participation in global GDP, in global trade, actually strengthen their political and economic capacity to influence international affairs. A recent example of this very close relationship between transnational corporations and governments is the negotiation of the so-called TRIPS waiver. As you may recall, South Africa and India, and supported by many developing countries, requested during COVID-19 a waiver for the obligations under the TRIPS agreement. And there was a strong opposition by the governments of the United States, by the European Union, by UK, by Switzerland, where the very big pharmaceutical companies actually have the location. And in the end, as you know, to a extent they succeeded. They frustrated the objective of the TRIPS waiver request. And what was obtained is a very narrow and a very late waiver that has not so far been useful. And then let me make a couple of final comments on the subject. The first one was already suggested by the ambassador from Pakistan. In fact, in the 70s, the objective was to control transnational corporations. The new international economic order opened the opportunity for the negotiation of an international code of conduct on transnational corporations. As we know, this attempt failed, as it was also failed the attempt to have a code of conduct on transfer of technology, but also the UN unit that was created to deal with transnational corporation was abolished. So this is completely true. The fact that now in UN there is no way in which the phenomenon, the expansion of transnational corporation is under any control. And second final comment is that paradoxically, although during the 70s and the 80s there was a lot of analysis and literature about transnational corporations, their power, their expansion, so on and so forth, in the last few years you cannot find so much. So it's interesting that the last report I did refer to before of OECD in 2020, the title of this report is Multinational Enterprises in the Global Economy, heavily debated but hardly measured. And this is the point, and I think we need to do an effort in order to better measure the dimension, the power of transnational corporation. But then the fact is that if these stakeholders become members of the system, they can act on the same footing as states. They can influence decisions for which they will not be accountable, because in the end, as you know, although there is some debate among scholars about the extent to which a legal entity, a transnational corporation, may be the subject of international law. In fact, the fact is that they are not subject to obligations which just are binding for states. And then in the multi-stakeholder approach, the main representatives are these transnational corporations with the kind of power they have just referred to, and they can influence decisions in two ways. One, directly, if they participate as such, and secondly, indirectly, because their governments will also support their own views and interests. So we have two ways in which the interests of transnational corporations will be reflected in these negotiations and in any outcomes that these may have. So it is possible, and certainly it is the case, that some companies have some programs where some public interests are addressed. In many cases, they are part of communication policies. But it's quite clear, as Fiona mentioned at the very beginning, that their objective is to make profits, is not to serve the public interest, is not to create public goods in a way that, in particular, these public goods can address the problems of poor people, the most vulnerable, and those living in developing countries. So in conclusion, it is clear that when a process in UN or in other fora is taking place, there is a need to know the views of the private sector. There is a need to involve civil society, and I fully agree with the comments by the Ambassador of Cuba about this divergence between the northern civil society representatives and those coming from the south and the lack of resources of the latter. But then consultation is okay. So knowing what their strategies, what their views are, is fine, is necessary. But the clear point was mentioned by our two distinguished speakers before, is that it is not admissible to accept that they can participate at the same level, on the same footing as state. So the UN should remain a state-led process, as indicated in the report by Professor Gleckman. And all efforts need to be done. The threat is a significant one. Ambassador Pedroso referred to a potential threat to developing countries. This is the case. This may be a major threat if a reform of the UN take place and in the future actions that can be taken in the context of this organization. Well, thank you very much again. And it was a real pleasure to participate, and I'm very thankful for the intervention that have been made.
Yeah, thank you, Carlos. It's now my turn to call Anita Gurumurthy. Anita, we are really, of course, very keen. Anita is the Executive Director of IT for Change. We are very keen to hear from your perspectives and for the work IT for Change is doing on digitalization in this context. So we ask you to share your views with us, and maybe, yeah, as we have a kind of, maybe it's a recurring problem that there's never enough time actually to sort of have enough exchange on this. So we would like to ask the people who are here in the room if we can extend maybe for 15 minutes, so we can also have the benefit of your views in this conversation this morning. So Anita, you lead us off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Britt. And it's indeed an honor to be here and also to participate with my extremely esteemed colleagues on the panel. What I would like to do today is that on September 1st, based on the public consultations towards the Global Digital Compact process, the honorable ambassadors of Sweden and Rwanda, who are the co-facilitators, came out with a summary and assessment of the deep dives and consultations that were held earlier this year. As I read the document, which is just 1 week old, I just felt that it is an excellent example. It's an exemplar of that slippage that ends up conflating openness with public reason. So while open dialogue is one prerequisite of public reason, processes of public reason are very much larger. They need to be grounded in structures that recognize dissenting worldviews, alternative imaginaries, not legitimated necessarily by the powerful. And in fact, I really feel when I read the assessment that these discussions held through thematic tracks or deep dives were actually held during a time zone that aligned with the United States workday, which simply means that large parts of the world, consider, for instance, New Zealand, consider small islands in the Pacific, who could simply not participate. And of course, my colleagues stayed up late, and it's really unclear what the representativity of this kind of multi-stakeholder consultation really was, and what this assessment, which is a consensus document from the co-facilitators, is going to do in terms of the framing of the Global Digital Compact. I think we really need to sit up and take note of whether virtual consultations, as wonderful and democratizing as they are, if conducted within certain materialities and structures and in the international order, is really going to democratize the debate at all. Obviously, these are also times when textual submissions go through big data analysis. And I really wonder how this summary can be representative of a process of public does not capture and legitimize the diversity of views, and when it is so structured in ways as to privilege some voices from some parts of the world. And this is what multi-stakeholderism does. You miss the woods for the trees. So what I'm going to do is quote parts of this 2-page summary. I can immediately after my submission paste the link on the chat window. And the summary is intended to build political consensus, but what we must do is to trace the silences in the discourse to show how contestations in the digital space, as Ambassador Munir so wonderfully spoke about, in the digital context, they really subvert the kind of unjust and unfair history of global norm making on the digital. So, of course, firstly, this assessment establishes and says that, and I quote, "We have identified wide support from diverse perspectives for the establishment of a GDC, a Global Digital Compact, that rests on the principles of the UN Charter, Agenda 2030, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights." Quotation ends. Of course, 20 years ago, during the World Summit on the Information Society, when the declaration came out with a call for inclusive, people-centered information society, a compromise was reached. This was about technical fragmentation, which was held as not desirable, but what could countries do? Countries couldn't do very much because the internet is an artifact that was under the control of ICANN, which logically in US territory meant that you couldn't do very much about the control that one country exercises over the material infrastructures of the internet. It was decided then that the public policy issues of the internet really have to be resolved globally. And of course, grounded in the UN Charter and human rights. The status quo since then for 20 years has been that we've completely in the digital domain refused to allow people's agenda to go forward. For the longest time, we have seen calls and exhortations for self-regulation. Corporations were seen as the harbingers of internet freedom. Don't forget that social media companies gave you your freedoms. And for good measure, since then, state surveillance has been used as the bogeyman, and that too state surveillance in certain countries, as if the human rights records of certain other countries is better. So this kind of digital colonialism has coexisted with what my esteemed colleague on the panel, Ambassador Munir, spoke about in terms of the investment dispute resolution mechanisms, forum shopping. Constantly trade agreements are, forcing countries to get into adverse terms in e-commerce. We really don't talk about intellectual property. We do not talk about financing for development in digital infrastructure. And we have normalized in the digital domain the outsourcing of governance because we believe that our foundational developmental infrastructure will be governed by corporations. So that is actually the reality. The second thing that this assessment report says, and I quote, is, in this regard, the importance of connectivity and digital public infrastructure was highlighted by many, and a GDC could support exchange and best practices among countries on digitalization in this regard. We must note that quite at the same time that this assessment came out, we also saw the ministerial declaration on the SOTF. And in fact, in that, they have simply canceled out the idea that science, technology, and innovation should be based on reciprocity. The development of science, technology, and innovation should be based on technology transfer, on exchange of technologies, and capacity building. That has been struck out, whereas in the GDC, we are trying to say that connectivity and digital public infrastructure will be provisioned through a public-private partnership route. So what does this mean? This simply means that globally, the digital public infrastructure debate is moving in the direction of alliances where we only see free riding on citizen data commons by private players and countries that don't have the bargaining power, don't have the institutional capabilities to make good their data resources, are really not being allowed to nurture their fledgling public digital innovation ecosystems. The third thing I want to quote from this assessment document is universal, affordable, and accessible connectivity was highlighted as a key issue. And the co-facilitators conclude that there is emerging convergence on the need to build digital capacities through engaging public-private partnerships and promoting greater financial investment in affordable, accessible mobile connectivity. So the idea that digital public goods can actually be provisioned as a right is nowhere in the document. What the summary does is it decouples the relationship between universal public goods and public investment, infrastructure development and strategic public policy, human resources and investments in people's capabilities. So the whole agenda of connectivity and inclusion has been reduced to a private sector agenda. And this is something that scholars like Alison Jill Wald from Research ICT Africa have highlighted repeatedly, that you see an inequality paradox in the world. The more you have access, the greater you have inequality. And private digital innovation is simply not delivering. And that has been proven time and again by research. The next thing I want to quote from the report is it says, avoiding internet fragmentation was highlighted by many. And the report says, a key role has been argued for promoting global and interoperable nature and governance of the internet. What is really shocking is that the G77 submission has been ignored in the summary. In fact, if as a data scientist, you ask somebody, they would say you have to count the submission by the G77 and China 135 times for the base pattern of the data structure when you do big data analysis on this text. Why? Because the G77 group has 134 countries. So you must count their submission so many times, right? In fact, the G77 and China have clearly said that we need and we commit to multilateral, democratic, and transparent approaches. So how did this document conclude in a sweeping way that there is consensus about a multi-stakeholder approach towards the governance of the internet? What happened to the submission of the G77, I wonder? So the next thing is, and I quote from this document, the need to leverage data and cross-border data flows for economic growth and progress. Now, the lack of rules on cross-border data transfers in the current context entrenches precisely big tech interests. It perpetuates an extractive neocolonial data economy. And notably, the US submission to the GDC process adopts a strategic silence on the global data governance question. And all these submissions are available online, on the UN site. And it actually prescribes that we must open up government data and read the silence, government data of developing countries, and reinforce data protection. So this is like preaching good behavior to governments in the marketplace of data flows that it blatantly seeks to control. And the US stance here is akin to what Gayatri Chakravarti's PVAC describes about white men saving the brown women from their brown men. So indeed, this is like talking about how we must start with a free flow of data across borders when some companies will control the data of the rest of the world. So, I could go on, but I really want to conclude that what we see in this assessment is a normalization of certain desirable aspects, right? And this is not even an accurate big data analysis. The data is not representative because certain people could not even participate. The imaginaries of the Maori group of people who were sleeping when this consultation was held really is about sovereignty. It is about data sovereignty. It's not about the recommendation of this report that we should have a loose code of conduct for information integrity. what is the meaning of code of conduct? Do we want to reduce multilateralism to a code of conduct? Do we actually see a code of conduct standing in for democracy, globally or otherwise? So the kind of missing morality of public reason that we actually see in this document exemplifies for me this kind of crisis we see in multilateralism being reduced to a code of conduct, even as certain countries are blocking the binding treaty on TNC. They're blocking the UN Model Tax Convention. So this is very, very interesting. The Wikimedia Foundation clearly has proposed that government should balance intellectual property rights with the right to information and ensure the continued existence of a robust public domain globally. Now, all of these views do not appear in the summary at all. And that really means that everything, in fact, that the two issues are reduced to a necessary postscript and no brownie points for guessing. One is about the digital gender divide. So gender equality appears at the end, and the other is climate justice. So both are like postscripts. And Harris has spoken to the critical issue of sovereignty of peoples, individuals. You know, sovereignty is a vital issue, not only because it links to self-determination and freedoms in the here and now. Sovereignty is important because it is the foundational connector between the present and the future. People's claims today and their rights tomorrow. And therefore, I think that when we look at the digital domain, we must see that this entire issue of development sovereignty in the data age and the digital age is erased. And what we are left with is a kind of crisis, which is like the theater of the absurd, right? Everyone knows what the problem is, but we don't want to set up a specialized agency on frontier technologies like, you know, the moment when ITU was born, right? ITU was born because it was felt that telecommunications was a global public good. And we do need one such agency at this point in time. We need dedicated global public financing and a reform of the international financial institutions. We
need to ask you to make this the last few seconds. Thank you.
All right. So I just want to say that the agenda of internationalizing the governance of critical internet resources remains. The internet is not still internationalized. And finally, I think we should think about, in not so far in the future, a treaty process on digital human rights that articulates the nature of individual and social autonomy in the digital age. Thank you so much, Britt, and sorry I took time.
Thank you very much, Anita. So now we have 4 questions from the chat, from the Zoom, but also we would like to gather some questions or reflections from people's here and giving to the panelists 1 or 2 minutes for closing, very general responses or closing remarks. Okay. As I said, time's never enough to discuss this type of things, but yeah. So let me go to the questions and then while you think if you want to talk or not. So we have 4 questions, one from Claudio Schuffman from the People's Health Movement. Question is, what realistic possibility does the South Center have to influence the countries it represents to vote against the UN 2.0 given the findings of Paris report? And then we have 2 questions from Shaidana Fidisi. First, thanks for the interventions. And it would be great to hear more about the information we have about who is driving the push toward multi-stakeholderism. Has anyone tracked which corporations or corporate entities are really driving that rhetoric in different spaces? What is our best example to point to how TNCs are driving this, in case they are? The second group of questions, actually, is she would love to hear more about the solutions piece of this and digging deeper on the aspect of how we could reform multilateralism to better serve peoples on the planet while resisting multi-stakeholderism. And the third group of questions is for state representatives. Is how do we bring more states into this understanding of the threats posed by multi-stakeholderism and actually build enough opposition to oppose this agenda? And there yet will build enough support for a more democratic and just multilateral system. So these are the several questions of Shaira. I don't know if someone here in the room would like to share a reflection or have a question.
Maybe you may ask her to come here.
Introduce yourself.
Thanks so much. My name is Mahinur El-Badrawi. I work with the Center for Economic and Social.
You want to come here?
Uh,
So the camera, because if not, we go to.
okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. My name is Mahinur El-Badrawi. I work for the Center for Economic and Social Rights. We are a global organization that works towards a just economic system through human rights. So yes, my question is around human rights and, viewing the SDGs from a rights perspective. We know that, states have duties towards economic and social needs. And we've seen the human rights system also react, especially after COVID, towards this, TNC's capture of governance. So I guess my question is, what role do you see for leveraging human rights as a tool to push back and say, this system does not leave space for states to really fulfill their obligations. And we've seen also, and we know that non-state actors also, have obligations towards economic and social rights, because we've always seen like a constant push of, no, we don't have obligations, no, but we have the Maastricht principles, we have this, we have that. There is a body of norms that say they do have obligations, but they're constantly resistant. So I guess, yeah, that's my reflection and my question about leveraging the human rights system in this fight.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Someone else? Would be good if you want to talk, come here. Don't be shy. Okay. So let's do maybe the same order, the round of responses from the panelists, or do you prefer to close? Close, okay. So
maybe Carlos.
Maybe we can start with Carlos.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you, Claudio Schuften, for your questions about what the South Center can do in order to influence the vote and decision on this matter. But as I mentioned, as you know, the South Center is an intergovernmental organization. We work very closely with our members and other developing countries on the basis of solidarity. And we work very, very closely with a group of 77 plus China, and really commend the very excellent work done during this period by the presidency of Cuba in many areas. So the South Center is organizing precisely these events and has sponsored with the Transnational Institute this excellent report by Professor Gleitman, just to make again the point that there is a need to react against this trend towards this multi-stakeholder approach. And I think the discussion here has been extremely useful. The suggestions both by Ambassador Pedroso and by Ambassador Munir are very useful. You will find more suggestions about how to deal with this issue in the report by Harris Gleitman. So we will continue to work on this. Of course, we respect the views of our members and developing countries. Certainly, sovereignty is recognized, and we are not going to tell our members and developing countries what should be done. But our objective is to provide advice, to provide solid evidence in order for these governments to take the right action. So we hope that we can actually influence the outcome with these contributions that we are making and we continue to make. Perhaps I would just try to respond briefly to the last question about leveraging human rights system. I think that's important. We haven't seen too much in this respect in the policy brief produced by the Secretary General, for instance, in relation to this global digital compact. And I think there is a further need to make it clear that in the context of the summit, which is under preparation, another exercise in UN, the human rights approach must be present. In our view, there is today a major problem, is a fragmentation of the international system. And this leads to some lack of connections in some issues. And introducing human rights in a more systematic manner may help very much the process and the interests of developing countries, and the people living in developing countries and elsewhere, of course. Thank you very much.
Now, I'm going to give the floor to Ambassador Munir.
Thank you very much. I think there were three remarks or questions posed, and maybe I should respond to them. Firstly, who's pushing this agenda? I think we don't need to look very hard to know where this is coming from. But I think what is dangerous and what we must be concerned about is that it's being pushed now from inside the United Nations. And I think that we need to, express this and to hold the Secretariat accountable for the proposals that are made, which are clearly contrary to the Charter and contrary to the interests of the member states. And I think that is a point that we need to think how to express it. How do we bring more member states into our point of view? Harris has expressed and that we've all discussed today. And I think the answer is that the Group of 77 has to play a much more active role and to bring forward some ideas and proposals to put on the table for adoption. Perhaps we should do this as quickly as possible, and perhaps Harris can help in drafting something for the Group of 77. I'm sorry, Pedro is not with us, but I think it might be useful for the Group of 77 ministerial meeting that's going to come in 2 weeks to at least start this process of developing a common position on this issue as such. And that's thirdly, the issue of how to leverage human rights. I think it's a broader issue on human rights. First of all, we have to succeed in our efforts to obtain recognition for the right to development. We haven't succeeded so far. A draft convention is being drafted, and it's going to be put in the Human Rights Council. We have to mobilize there to get that adopted and passed to the General Assembly so that we can vote on that in the Assembly as such. But there are, of course, the digital compact. We need to put into the digital compact the idea of digital human rights, equality, etc. And lastly, I think that the whole issue of the responsibility of transnational corporations ought to be revived. And we gave up the fight in the 1980s. I think we need to come back to think about that code of conduct, both on code of conduct on the responsibility of TNCs and also the code of conduct and technology, which was, I think, very relevant. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thanks to you. So now we are giving the floor to Anita for this last
30 seconds.
1-2 minutes closing remarks. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll just take 30 seconds. I think along with, who's driving this is the question of what is really driving this? What is that sense of complacence? It's almost like all of us are in paralysis. But I do think that there is a serious delegitimization of the public, and there is tremendous narrative power coming because of the infrastructures of media today. And that talks to certain so-called progressive language, right? Everybody is talking about the commons, but there can be no commons without the commoners. So that's very important. Similarly, everyone is talking about colonialism, right? But nobody is really talking about what is the content of sovereignty. So I think we really have to challenge these vocabularies. And secondly, I really want to say that history, of course, allows us ways to define and redefine and shape democracy. I think time today is to start shaping from the local. It always was like that, but this is not really the Bretton Woods moment. It's not the moment when the UNHRC was, instituted and we got human rights. I think there's a lot of unease because Canada, Australia, many jurisdictions have come up with regulation to contain the big tech. And I think subnational regulation, local ideas of governing for the commons, for the commoner, I think that is the innovation we need. Thank you very much.
You have to start again. My mistake, sorry.
Right. Thank you very much. I think that the historical references that the ambassadors shared about the multi-decade-long set of issues about transnationals and the governance of transnationals is very relevant. In global governance terms, there's a narrative. What's the story we want to convey that legitimates a need for global institutions? Then there's the actual institutions for carrying them out. And then there's the issue of power. We've heard in some areas, there's what our challenge is to face the reality that we're trying to delegitimize a direction which is now coming from outside the UN system, driven by those amongst those around the World Economic Forum, and unfortunately now driven inside by those who are proposing that multi-stakeholderism be understood by memorandums of understanding with organizations like the World Economic Forum, or where the World Health Organization has to almost involuntarily work with COVAX because governments are sending the money outside the multilateral system. That's the institutional element. And I think that what has been raised about having a set of new principles, maybe developed through the G77, and Ambassador, I'd be pleased and honored to work with members of the 77 to try to work out some of these principles, is important to change that narrative and to open doors for new institutions, as was raised about the governance of the internet. But with a bit of thinking, we actually need many more institutions. because we have many more global challenges which are unmet by our current arrangement. And so I think one of the visions for the future is to look perhaps at some of the menus of options that developing countries and others in the multilateral arena could take to constrain the further growth of multi-stakeholderism and to articulate what one would want in a new system of global governance. To return to the history, we have a set of institutions born largely after the Second World War. We unquestionably have systemic crises of enormous magnitude, which those institutions are not yet able and probably are not able to meet. And we have to recognize that and move to the next step to describe the correct institutions for a system of global governance in order to contain power in different ways. So I thank again the South Center, I thank again the Transnational Institute, and I thank all those participating in this conversation and in going forward on these issues. Thank you.
I mean, it's hard to say exactly where we're at in this conversation, meaning in a way, it's a conversation that's been percolating for a long time, I think. And I like very much what Ambassador Munir said when he said, well, maybe it's time to return to the fight. I think, you know, all of us who are here, either online or here today, we've come with a sense of urgency, actually, I think, because not only because of the crisis, and maybe our biggest challenge is not to be overcome by the magnitude of the crisis, no, but to kind of rediscover where the leverage of real power can be in relation to the states. And I think we have some, I think many of you are aware that there is, maybe it's not parallel in the sense that it's not tackling the comprehensive agenda, but the agenda that we are pursuing on the binding treaty at the UN Human Rights Council is very instructive. I mean, it's highly contested. I mean, I guess the very thought of really saying the day of voluntarism is over, we really need binding obligations on transnational corporations and really determined with that. And it's been highly contested. It's been protracted. However, what is very encouraging from that is that there is consistent, robust pushback by mainly developing states and the collaboration with civil society and affected communities. And this is really making the difference. And I think we can draw a lot of encouragement from this and see that, you know, maybe we need to see more how the interrelation of these struggles go forward. And we hope we can also have the opportunity to discuss this further with all our colleagues in civil society, and especially, to, in a sense, nuance and mature the proposals we would like to be able to contribute to in the process going forward from the Summit of the Future. Thank you all very much. Thanks to our very patient audience here also. And we hope you can stay and join us for lunch and for exchange. This is what this day is all about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brid. We would like to finish commenting that this activity is part of the work that we are doing as TNIs and Friends of the International, but with other organizations in the People's Working Group on Multistakeholderism. That is a group of organizations, social movements that has been researching several areas of the global governance like health, education, food and agriculture, climate, finance, internet and digital technologies, and energy, among others. And from that research and participation in different spaces, we have have been identifying, the rising of multi-stakeholderism and the threat that this is posing to democracy, to multilateralism, but so at the end as to democracy. And so this group is concerned about these threats. We clearly state that, but it's also concerned about improved democracy, not just defend democracy, but also improve democracy. So we would like to finish mentioning that this is part of an ongoing work with more organizations, and also in a direct collaboration between this People's Working Group and the South Center. So thank you very much to all of you to be here today or to be in the Zoom, and yeah, thank you.